Well, thank you all so much for joining me on the debut of this new show. I hope it's going to be everything you want it to be. And of course, the same punchy debates as ever and great analysis will be on this show every single weekend. But on that note, let's get started, shall we? Britain is rapidly becoming a minority white British country. Government data from January to September 2024 shows white British births at just 53.8%, with Asians at 17.3%, other white groups at 10.5%, black at 7.1%, mixed at 7%, and unstated at 2.6%. This shift is happening fast, and it's, of course, changing the face of our nation. Now, this is going to be an uncomfortable conversation, one the establishment have refused to have with you for decades. And I say this, and I'm talking about this as someone with two mixed ethnicity brothers who I love to the bottom of my heart, both fully integrated and as culturally British as me. But we have to face the truth. These stark figures will reshape our cultural identity. And let's be honest, we're now at a stage where some migrant communities no longer have to integrate at all. Some haven't even tried. This is Birmingham and Ilford recently. Yeah, this of course isn't about hate or rejecting other cultures. It's about asking if multiculturalism has worked as you were promised. Have migrants and their children blended into our society as we were told they would time and time again? We'll look at some of the areas of Britain. Entire communities have lost their British identity because, in my opinion, white British people are nearly gone in those areas. The Windrush generation, many accept as well integrated, and of course, perhaps because at that time Britain was over 90% white British. Did we ever have a national debate about mass migration's long-term effects on the country? Did you ever vote for this? Because for years, the Tories pledged to limit migration to the tens of thousands. But of course, in the end, they end up allowing millions here in the UK. And now, with births barely over half with white British, we are now facing a seismic cultural shift. So where's the plan for integration? Was there even a plan to start for? And look, this is clearly not what many people voted for, but I want to get the thoughts of my panel. Former Labour advisor Paul Richards, journalist and broadcaster Linda Jubilee, former Scotland Yard detective Peter Blexley. Peter, I'll start with you. And these figures, of course, many people are going to sort of stay away from them almost. Many of the mainstream media aren't going to want to talk about this, Peter, because, of course, then you get the cries of racism. You get the cries of discrimination. But I think we need to have a national conversation.
I'm going to celebrate the 7% of the mixed, right? Because that, for me, is integration.
Yep.
People from different cultures, different coloured skin, maybe different faiths, different nationalities, whatsoever that may be, that, for me, shows integration. When people come to this country, carve a way forward, pay their taxes, and actually people of different coloured skin fall in love with each other and raise wonderful children and integrate into this nation, then I take that very much as a positive.
Yeah.
So that's 7%, good on them.
Yeah.
That figure should be vastly, vastly larger if we were having an integrated nation. That would be a much bigger percentage. But of course, we're not. And only today I heard about, was actually speaking to a wonderful, wonderful young man who comes from, he's as British as bacon and eggs, born here, you know what I mean? But his cultural background is bringing pressure from the family to only marry somebody from a similar cultural and race background, which for me is not integration.
Yeah, we see it all the time, don't we, Peter? We see that cultural pressure, say, we're marry within your own group, have kids within your own group, don't we? We see that all the time.
Yeah, and that's not the way forward for an integrated, cohabiting, happy kind of universal society.
Absolutely. Linda, of course, when we talk about birth rates, we can't be amiss and say that, of course, white British people are having less kids.
Yes, fewer and fewer, and that is because there are very big components of that is because women have decided it's very expensive, it's very stressful, it's very difficult to have a career, build a career and care for children. And so they said, guess what? We might make the decision not to have any children. I know someone in my family is very close to making that decision herself, but it is very common now, and that is why the birth rate has gone down to something like 1.4%, which sounds good, but it's averaged out. But that is very problematic because it brings us below the level at which we have to replace people. That's what the economic factor is, because if you don't have enough people of any description being born, then they do not grow up to work and provide money for the exchequer. And that's what's really important, because we can't have growth without an increasing birth rate. You've only got to look at Japan, which is the fastest growing ageing population on the planet, to see that they are actually finally deciding, for one reason or another, good or for ill, to take migrants, because it's the only way they can think of instigating economic growth.
And that is the same reason I believe the government have always maintained they need to bring people into this country. It's been the same old argument. We're not having enough kids, we need to import millions of people, which I don't think that argument really holds up in the end.
I'll just say one more thing, because what as you notice when you look at the tables, in developing countries, they always have more children, 6, 7, 8 children, because that's what happens over there, because those children are therefore, there's no welfare state. They look after their parents as they're getting older. In much more developed countries like our own, the birth rate always goes down.
Paul, I showed some footage there of people celebrating Pakistani culture, and listen, I'm all for people celebrating their cultures, but it is almost evident to many people across the country when they look at some towns, they go, that town actually isn't culturally British anymore. They look at the signs, they look at the shops, they look how people dress, they look what languages people speak there. That, for me, is a problem, because the whole point of our society bringing these people is that they were going to eventually become British, as my two little brothers, I would say, very much are very British.
I mean, first of all, change is our only constant in this country. So the population has always grown, and we've had different waves of immigration coming in over the last 2,000 years. And in the first wave, there's always this cultural resistance. When the Jews arrived in the East End with their own language and their own signs up in their own alphabet and their funny food like fish and chips and all this stuff, there was a resistance to that. There was an Aliens Act introduced in Parliament to stop them. But, in a generation or two, they've moved out, they've got money, they've gone to North London, they've, assimilated completely. The same when the Irish came, and there was a resistance against the Catholics and saying, they'll only marry other Catholics and they're not integrating, and they've got their own churches, their own pubs, and they integrated, and, the Irish managed to do it. And so this next generation, the sons and the daughters of the people you're describing who are not integrated now, they will be.
No, I'm not sure that they will. I'm not sure they will at all.
On this very subject, Paul.
Is it different now?
You've only got to look at cousin marriage to know that not only are people being encouraged to marry within their own community, they're being encouraged to marry their relatives.
Make it illegal.
You have to make it illegal because the birth disabilities are so severe now amongst some communities. But we absolutely know, and I know from being in the front line on the ground delivering English language programmes, that there are women that move to this country that never learn to speak the English language.
But their children do.
No,
that's the point. They do know how to learn. There aren't children growing up.
On this whole,
there are girls in the Afghan community that.
On this whole birth subject, let's not forget that many people are, I would say, rightfully alarmed by the fact that for the last 3 years, the most popular boy's name for babies in this country has been Mohammed, and that is only one spelling of Mohammed. There are numerous spellings of that name. So when people see that, and it's not, as you might expect in Britain, Oliver or Harry or James or Peter, unlikely, people go, what? And that is what drives people's well-held and entirely justified concerns, not only around the lack of integration, but also the rise of Islam. The first census when I was born, there were 21,000 Muslims in the UK. There are now 4 million.
Yeah, because Paul, you were saying that talking about the Jewish community who came over here. We're talking about a different time, and they didn't come over in the millions of that we see today. We're
They
seeing
came over in huge numbers after
but
the...
we're not talking about millions of people, Paul. We're talking about tens of maybe a few thousand people here and there, but we're now talking about mass. Under the Boris wave, we had 1 million people enter the country. How on earth are they expected to culturally integrate? You go to look at places like Ilford. We showed pictures of it there. They're celebrating Pakistani culture. They're raising massive flags. Would you ever see them doing that with the Union flag? I don't think you would.
Well, I think the next generation would, and in each generation they do it. Enoch Powell in 1968 predicted race wars, didn't he? He said rivers of blood, and in fact that population got on with it, integrated. It's a model actually of integration.
But
in the 60s
on
and
the race wars, you're right. But we
so he was wrong, wasn't he?
And I will say this, and I say this, and I don't mean this in a horrible way, but I feel like we're not getting far away from that with these illegal migrant protests. People feel like the cultural fabric is breaking down in this country. I seriously do.
Paul, there are numerous communities in the UK, and we can jump on the tube train from here, and in 20 minutes we'll be cemented in the heart of them, that are fundamentally not integrated. They are separate entities.
That's true in every generation. And then within a generation, they make their money, they move out to nicer houses, they go off to university, and they become a different population.
Some do,
just
and
like the
some
Irish
don't.
in Kilburn did, and the Jews in the East End.
Point I was just because I want
now
to
we've
hear
got
from
the
Linda.
Koreans in South London, and then it happens and they move on.
But this is what I was talking about when I was giving my rant there. There are a whole generation, I think the Windrush generation is a good example. We're going back, 30, 40,
all
50
the
years ago,
Huguenots,
right?
all the Danes,
those
or
people
anybody
came
else,
here when Britain was well above 90% British. They had to integrate. There wasn't a choice. You go to some parts of London now, and actually you would have to integrate with them because you would be a minority. And that is what I'm talking about. How can you expect British values and British culture to thrive in an area where actually there are no white British people? Do you think that it would thrive in those areas? I don't think it would.
No, I've been to areas. I actually ran a sewing collective for Afghan women. I had to go into Luton to buy all the material. I had to take a translator with me because no one in the shop spoke any English at all. Right? And that's of any age from about 17 onwards. And the young girls that I was dealing with are really penned in at home. They do not get out. They do not integrate. And that's a problem in this society. We know that that's what happens because that's what happens in Afghanistan, and that behaviour is imported here.
Especially when you're then surrounded by a community of people from Afghanistan who perpetuate that culture. They don't go, actually, we're in Britain now, we need to integrate, because actually they're surrounded by people who don't believe. I
must say, I know notable examples of people, Afghans, for example, who have integrated.
Of course.
But there are really big pockets of people who remain very, very isolated, and that is a problem.
Peter, my stepfather came over here, well before I was born. We're going about 40, 50 years ago now. Extremely well integrated man into British society, and I know there are millions of people like that in this country, and that is what I wanted to make that point in my rant, because I know there are. However, I think that is getting more and more difficult with the mass. The Prime Minister was celebrating 400,000 people coming here. That's the size of Bristol.
Yeah, and it's ludicrous, and it's also unsustainable. And Paul's naivety about going back generation upon generation and talking about how the Huguenots integrated is quite frankly drivel, because what is happening now, so many people are coming into the UK and they are heading for where those communities that they know and recognise are, and those communities in turn are growing. People, just look at the East End of London, for example. White natives of London have abandoned the East End. They have headed for Essex and other kind of places and moved out as they became minorities in their own environments.
But to bring this conversation back to how we started it, we've got to be thinking about how we can encourage women to be having children, how we can support them to have children, how we can improve childcare, how we can improve all sorts of support for them, so that, because raising a family is the single most important thing I think I've ever done.
Totally right.
And actually, we need to recognise its importance in society. Otherwise, we'll only have ourselves to blame.
Yeah, I don't... Paul, obviously, we talk about the benefits cap on children here quite a lot. The Prime Minister said he won't release the benefits cap. He's going to stick to, I think it's two-child policy there on that. Do we need to drop things like that to incentivise more birth?
I don't know about that specific policy, but I completely echo Linda's point about the support that families need. It was a disaster when the Conservatives got rid of Sure Start, for example, which helped a lot of people have a family and get on and do to raise children. And I think you need to look at how we integrate work with childcare. You know, there are people who are working just to pay for the childcare, which is nuts, isn't it?
You could make childcare tax deductible, for example. There's a number of things you could do.
If people weren't taxed at such astonishingly high rates, maybe they'd be able to afford to start families earlier. But there's another note here. Youngsters, it's been proven, are drinking less.
Yeah.
Well, I've never fathered a child sober. if they drank more, they might have more kids.
Do you know what? I like that. It was Dr. Renault on my previous show said drugs, rock and roll, sex, that's what all those eras are gone. But yeah, I think you might be right. Anyway, moving on. I know these are difficult conversations, but we want to have them on this show. We want to have them on this show. I want to have these conversations the mainstream media won't have and your political elite won't have, and that's what we're going to be all about.